He drove 18-wheelers for a living, but every night, alone in his truck, he wrote symbols no one else could read until they started predicting the future of Wall Street. Monday night. Somewhere along I-70, a truck rumbled toward Ohio under a sky smeared with frozen clouds and fluorescent stars. Behind the wheel sat Calvin Brooks, 42, with one hand resting lightly on the steering wheel, the other tapping his thigh in a rhythmic pattern only he could follow. The radio whispered some old Motown tune, but he wasn't really listening. His mind was on the patterns. Calvin's rig was older than most, a beat-up Freightliner with a cracked dashboard and a patchwork of duct tape where the glove box used to be. But in the small compartment behind the driver's seat, where most long-haul drivers kept bedding or snacks, Calvin kept something different. 5 spiral-bound notebooks, 2 broken mechanical pencils, and a red marker. Each notebook was covered in symbols, strange, hand-drawn shapes, zigzags, waves, jagged spirals, arrows that curved instead of pointing, lines that sloped and broke mid-stretch, circled by tiny dots. There were no numbers, no dates, no typical graphs, just movement, rhythm, tension. To most, they looked like nonsense. To Calvin, they were language. He parked at a rest stop around midnight, just past the Indiana border. The lot was nearly empty, save for a few other rigs and a broken vending machine blinking red like a heartbeat. He climbed into the sleeper cab, unzipped his duffel, and pulled out Notebook 3, the red one. He flipped past dozens of pages until he found what he was looking for, a pattern he'd first noticed while driving through Kansas last month, after seeing back-to-back billboards for consumer credit apps. Something about the speed they were being rolled out didn't feel right. He didn't know code, he didn't know economics, but he knew tempo. He drew a line that curved left, then dipped abruptly. Beneath it, he marked it with 3 dots. That meant reaction lag. Then he drew a sharp red X through the middle of the line. That meant rupture. Calvin paused. 17 days, he muttered, almost like a prayer. Give or take. Then he set the marker down and closed his eyes. Most people who met Calvin didn't see a thinker. They saw an exhausted man with cracked knuckles and dirt under his fingernails. A man who said little and listened too closely. He'd dropped out of community college at 20 after his dad died in a machine shop accident. Since then, he'd driven trucks for over 2 decades, moving furniture, food, electronics, whatever paid. But Calvin had always listened to the world like it was humming a song only he could hear. In a grocery store, he'd tracked the pace at which customers checked out, where the stockers stood, how fast items moved off shelves. In cities, he watched how new banks opened, too quickly, too close together. He'd see the same names on billboards in Iowa and Texas within days, and each time he'd write something new in his notebooks. He never tried to show them to anyone, not until Jesse. Jesse Walters had been Calvin's only real friend from high school, a math kid, got out of town, made it to college in Chicago. Now he was back in Indiana doing something in logistics that sounded important and paid well enough to drive a leased BMW. One Friday, Jesse stopped by the truck depot while Calvin was unloading. "You still driving cross-country?" Jesse asked, arms crossed, watching Calvin haul crates. Calvin nodded. "Still listening?" Jesse smirked. "To what?" Calvin didn't answer. But later they sat in the truck cab drinking coffee, and Jesse noticed the red notebook. "What's that?" he asked. Calvin hesitated. Then, for reasons he couldn't explain, he opened it. Jesse flipped through a few pages and raised an eyebrow. "Looks like modern art. What am I looking at?" Calvin tapped a pattern. "That right there? I call it the fold-back loop. Last time I saw it, a chain of appliance stores went bankrupt 2 weeks later." Jesse squinted. You're telling me these drawings predict market collapse? Calvin shrugged. Not predict. Sense. Like when animals leave the forest before a quake. Jesse chuckled. You've been watching too many documentaries. But he took a photo of one of the pages anyway. A pattern with a double curve and a descending spiral. Calvin had written beside it in small red ink, Vertex Corp. Collapse in 17 days. 17 days later, Jesse called in the middle of the night. You watching the news? No. Vertex just filed for bankruptcy, securities fraud, class action pending. Calvin was silent for a long moment. I told you, it's in the rhythm. Jesse exhaled like he'd just stepped into cold water. Man, this can't be coincidence. Calvin said nothing. He didn't gloat. He just reached for his notebook. Over the next few weeks, Jesse kept calling. What do you have next? He asked. You got something else cooking in there? Calvin resisted. This wasn't a game to him. It wasn't a get-rich-quick thing. It was something sacred. Something that came from observation, solitude, and something deeper he couldn't explain. He didn't want it to be turned into strategy. But something had shifted. One night, while stopped in Ohio, Calvin sat alone in his cab with pages spread across the mattress like a constellation. He traced the lines with his fingers, green loops that dipped, blue dots aligned in triangles. He could see it forming. A crack. No, a wave. Not one company, but many. Not a blip. An earthquake. He began sketching again. The red marker moved like a violin bow across paper. Sequence, 23, blue, 4, left skew, 3, wave retraction. He stopped. Stared. This wasn't a single warning. It was a cascade. He looked at the last symbol, an arc wrapped in tight spirals with a single downward arrow. He'd only drawn that twice before, and both times the markets had dropped more than 8% in a week. He leaned back, heart pounding. Was it happening again? Had it already begun? Calvin closed the notebook and slid it beneath his pillow like it was something that could be stolen, something fragile and dangerous. He didn't sleep that night. The wind howled outside the truck stop. Lights flickered, and somewhere far away, numbers began to slip out of balance, and a man no one noticed kept writing, alone in the dark. Wall Street had algorithms. He had silence. And somehow, silence saw it first. Tuesday morning. A new sun broke gently over the horizon, spilling thin light through the truck stop diner's fogged-up windows. Calvin Brooks sat alone in a corner booth, his mug half full of bitter coffee, his eyes watching the steam rise like a signal only he could decode. Across from him lay a single sheet from his red notebook, folded once, twice, then smoothed out. The ink was faint where the creases had run. But the pattern was clear. 3 jagged humps, followed by a drop that narrowed like a noose. The waitress, June, with hair the color of cigarette smoke and a kindness carved into her over the years, refilled his cup and glanced at the page. "That your music?" she asked, not unkindly. Calvin didn't smile, but he nodded once. "Of a kind." June laughed. "You and your secret language. I used to think it was lottery numbers." He said nothing. She left, and Calvin kept staring at the lines. They weren't numbers, not in the traditional sense, but they sang to him, subtle harmonies buried in seemingly random events. Freight orders, billboard rotations, surge pricing for fast food at truck stops, weather data, consumer coupons mailed to Middle America. He never read code or spreadsheets. He read vibrations. He wasn't a genius, not in the textbook way. He couldn't tell you the difference between standard deviation and Sharpe ratio, but he could feel when a system was breathing wrong, just like a mechanic hears an engine that's off by a beat, just like a horseman senses a limp before the hoof hits wrong. Something was off. Later that day, on the highway between Columbus and Pittsburgh, Calvin listened to radio ads, not the products, but the pacing. Too fast, too frequent. Promotions cycling in awkward rhythm. A half-dozen fintech companies screaming urgency at the same time. He noted it. The world had begun to stutter. 3 days passed. Jesse showed up again. This time he didn't knock. Just opened the door of Calvin's rig and climbed in, a bundle of nervous energy wrapped in cologne and wool. "You remember that pattern from last week?" Jesse asked, breathless. "The drop after the 3 humps?" "Yes, it's starting." Calvin raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean, starting?" "I mean, 2 mid-sized hedge funds are halting withdrawals. One of them has exposure to leveraged tech bundles. They match your markers." Calvin frowned, pulled out a fresh sheet, and began sketching. "Did you check the commodity routes?" "I didn't." "Wait, what routes?" "Coal, steel, sugar." "Watch the shipping delays. That's where the distortion's thickest." Jesse blinked. "You're saying supply chain delay is a market signal?" "No," Calvin replied. "I'm saying the market is a shadow. The supply chain is the body." Jesse sat back, shaken. "You need to talk to someone, Cal. Someone big. This isn't just one company anymore. You're seeing something no one else is." Calvin looked down at his page. "I'm not seeing it," he whispered. "I'm hearing it." That night, Calvin didn't sleep. He pulled out all 5 notebooks, laid them across the floor of the sleeper cab like parchment from an ancient religion. Each line connected to another, colors layered like sediment. What had once been instinct now looked terrifyingly organized. He marked 7 separate patterns, each one previously associated with market disruption. Then he saw it, a repeat loop forming at the edges of all of them. An echo. He circled it in red and labeled it in small, Symphony, Phase 1. He exhaled slowly. It wasn't one event. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a wave coming toward the shore, and the sand had already started to pull back. Days passed, then a week. The Reddit post appeared, a blurry photo of Calvin's symbols, taken secretly by Jesse and posted in a thread titled, "Trucker predicted Vertex crash 17 days in advance. What else is in his notes?" It went viral in 24 hours. Some thought it was a joke. Others called it outsider art. A few dismissed it as conspiracy nonsense. But a data analyst at a mid-tier financial firm in New York paused. Her name was Sarah Liang, and she had just spent 6 months trying to train a neural net to identify pre-failure momentum in market patterns. And failing. Until she saw Calvin's drawings. Sarah stared at the photo. The jagged humps, the drop, the loop. She didn't know what they meant. But she knew the model she was trying to build had accidentally generated something similar. Once. It had been dismissed as a glitch. She printed the image. She zoomed in. She froze. The spacing of the peaks, the length between them, the slope of the drop. They weren't just similar. They were identical. Sarah turned to her whiteboard, erased everything she'd been working on for 6 months, and wrote in bold letters, "Brooks model, unknown variables, predictive potential." She searched for the origin of the image. She found the Reddit post. She found the name, Calvin Brooks. She found nothing else. No LinkedIn, no papers, no patents, no affiliation, just truck driver from Indiana. She stared at the screen. Then she whispered, to no one in particular, I think he hears what we can't. Meanwhile, Calvin sat in a diner in West Virginia, flipping a sugar packet over and over, notebook open beside him. He wasn't online. He didn't know he was being discussed on finance subreddits, tech forums, and anonymous Discord servers. He didn't know his sketch had been downloaded over 18,000 times in 48 hours. He was just watching a woman swipe her card 6 times at the register before it declined. He made a mark in his notebook. 3 dots, blue, downward triangle, consumer distress, non-urban cluster. The waitress asked if he wanted a refill. He nodded, then stared out the window. Outside, the snow was beginning to fall, but Calvin wasn't thinking about weather. He was thinking about how snow doesn't shout when it comes. It just falls quietly until it breaks a roof. She stared at the sketch for hours. It was wrong, but it was also real. And it was unfolding. In a sterile glass office 23 stories above Manhattan, Sarah Liang sat at her desk with her heart thudding too loudly for the quiet around her. She had shut the blinds, turned off Slack, ignored 3 meeting reminders. All she could see was the pattern. It was printed on a torn sheet of paper, posted now on her wall beside 2 years of failed AI models, each more complicated than the last. But this was hand-drawn, crude, uneven, and terrifyingly accurate. Sarah's background was pristine. MIT for undergrad, Wharton for grad school, a star in the rising field of predictive analytics. She built models that hedge funds trusted with millions. But lately her models had been glitching. Not failing, not crashing, just hesitating. As if the data knew something it couldn't explain. She called it shadow lag in her private notes, a phenomenon where the model slowed before volatility as though bracing. She'd tried to explain it in boardrooms. They'd called it statistical noise. But then someone on Reddit posted a grainy photo of a spiral-bound notebook filled with strange symbols and colored lines. And for the first time in months, Sarah's gut jolted like it used to in college when she glimpsed the shape of a real idea. She had stared at one image in particular. A loop, a narrow curve, then 3 rising humps, each with a tapering slope, followed by a steep, uninterrupted drop. She ran to her screen, pulled up the real-time data for Lexicon Capital. The shape matched, and Lexicon was wobbling. It shouldn't be possible. But there it was. 2 hours later, she called a friend at a boutique risk firm. "You ever heard of a Calvin Brooks?" Silence. Then, "No. Who's he with?" "He's not. He's a truck driver." "Is this a joke?" "I'm serious. Look him up. Or better yet, look at this." She emailed over the sketch. Another pause. Then quietly, "What the hell is that?" "I don't know," Sarah said. "But it's happening again. Just like with Vertex." "Are you saying he predicted—" "I'm saying he heard it. Somehow. Before we did." Meanwhile, far from Wall Street, Calvin sat alone in a weather-beaten truck stop outside Charleston, South Carolina. He hadn't touched his hash browns. He was focused on the map he was drawing in his mind. Not of roads, of movement. He traced his finger along the margin of the page, eyes darting between fragments. Midwest credit distortion, trucking overcapacity, cyclic ad rhythm crash, green mark. The signs were converging. One pattern in particular kept reappearing, a curvature in the delay between logistic surges and credit reporting. To someone else, it might look like lag, but to Calvin, it was a warning. He flipped the page, marked a wide arc, circled it 3 times, labeled it pre-collapse decoupling. A young man in a hoodie passed by, saw the notebook, and snorted. "That's supposed to be art, old man?" Calvin didn't even look up. "That's supposed to be silence," he murmured. "You don't have to listen, but it's already speaking." The boy laughed and walked on. That evening, Sarah emailed the Reddit poster directly. To her shock, he replied, "My friend took the pic. The guy's name is Calvin Brooks. He drives through Indiana. Said he's been writing this stuff for years. Didn't want to go public. Thought no one would believe him." She typed quickly. "Do you know where he'll be next?" "Somewhere near Cincinnati tomorrow. Truck depot, East Side." Sarah closed her laptop, packed a bag, booked a flight. She arrived the next day with no plan, just a name, a map, and a feeling she couldn't explain. The depot was loud, muddy, chaotic. She stood awkwardly near a line of rigs, scanning every face. Then she saw him. Tall, weathered, broad-shouldered. He moved slowly, deliberately, like someone who understood time better than those around him. He wore a faded green work jacket, and in his left hand was a red notebook with a cracked spine. Sarah stepped forward. "Mr. Brooks?" He turned, eyes wary but curious. "My name's Sarah Liang. I'm a data analyst." A pause. "I don't do interviews." "This isn't that." Another pause. She held up the printout. This shape. It shouldn't exist, but it does. It's showing up in markets I've been tracking, and it matches what's happening right now to Lexicon and Greenmark." Calvin's eyes softened. "You hear it too, then?" Sarah blinked. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer. He turned and gestured for her to follow. Inside the cab of his truck, he spread out the notebooks like sheet music across the bed. Sarah sat on the edge of the seat, stunned. They weren't random. They were layered, precise, color-coded, tagged with locations, seasons, routes, behaviors. Every inch of the page carried intention. "I don't have formulas," Calvin said quietly. "I just track the tension." "The tension?" "In the system. Like when the wind changes but the trees haven't moved yet." Sarah whispered, "This isn't math." "No," he said. "It's listening." For hours, they went page by page. Sarah watched the loops align with market shifts. Calvin described chain reactions using truck routes, grain prices, and the tone of radio ads. She realized, horrified, that some of his diagrams captured what her team had tried, and failed, to simulate with millions in funding. At last, she asked, "Do you know what this is?" Calvin nodded slowly. "I think it's a fault line." "A fault line?" "Yeah, a big one. Under everything." Back in New York, Sarah wrote a private memo and sent it to one person, her old professor at Wharton. She attached a photo of Calvin's spiral pattern. Subject: "This model is not a model." Body: "I've found something, or someone. What we thought were anomalies are echoes. There's a predictive logic, but it's not code. It's something older, and it's already started." That night, Calvin stood outside his truck, the wind tugging at his sleeves. He looked up at the dark sky and closed his eyes. The world was quiet. But in that silence, he could already hear the next fracture forming. It sounded like a violin string tightening, right before the snap. At first, they laughed. Then the banks started falling, and the man with the notebooks no one understood was the only one who wasn't surprised. It started with a tremble. Not on Wall Street, not in the numbers, at least not yet, but in the spaces between them. A hesitation in credit approvals, a sudden tightening of payment terms. A logistics company in Des Moines quietly laid off a third of its drivers. A grain futures firm postponed a quarterly call without explanation. And on a wind-stripped highway outside Columbus, Ohio, Calvin Brooks quietly circled a symbol on the back of his old red notebook. He drew 3 vertical strokes, jagged and broken. Over them, a swooping line. And beneath it all, a thick downward arc drawn in bold black ink. He labeled it simply, Fracture Chain, 9 to 14 days. Then he looked out across the truck stop parking lot. Semis lined up like forgotten soldiers, and whispered, "It's starting." Back in New York, Sarah Liang stared at her Bloomberg terminal as the real-time chart of Greenmark Capital flashed red. The line dipped, paused, then dropped again. News hadn't hit yet, but it would. She called Calvin immediately. "Did you see it?" she asked. "Didn't have to," he said. Sarah was quiet for a second. "Your pattern said 9 to 14 days. Today is day 10. Calvin didn't gloat. He never did. "I'm not counting the days. The system is." She leaned back in her chair, pulse quickening. "They're going to call you crazy, you know." "They already have." And they had. A blog post mocking the viral Reddit thread called him the prophet of potholes. Another finance influencer joked, "I trust the guy who built GPT-4 more than the one who built a notebook out of crayons." On CNBC, a segment titled Data Delusions featured a guest laughing, "So we're taking market advice from a trucker who draws spirals now?" But less than 24 hours after that segment aired, Greenmark Capital froze client withdrawals. Then, Lexicon Capital, still reeling, announced a sudden 22% loss in Q4 revenue. The spiral that Calvin had drawn months earlier had unfurled in real life. Exactly as he'd written. In Indiana, Jesse Walters watched it unfold on his phone with a stunned silence. He had known Calvin since high school, had teased him about the loop-de-loops in his notebooks, had posted that image on Reddit half as a joke. But now people were asking him for interviews. Journalists, hedge fund interns, conspiracy theorists, even a crypto exchange executive. Jesse didn't respond to any of them. Instead, he drove out to the edge of town, found Calvin refueling his truck, and handed him a printout. The headline read, "How did a long-haul trucker predict 2 financial collapses?" Calvin looked at the paper, then at Jesse. "I didn't predict anything," he said. Jesse raised an eyebrow. "You drew the whole thing before it happened." "I didn't see the future," Calvin replied. "I just listened when no one else was listening." Sarah, meanwhile, had begun compiling Calvin's symbols into a private archive. She digitized his patterns, overlaying them onto live economic indicators. She noticed something terrifying. The collapse patterns weren't stopping. They were stacking. Calvin hadn't found a one-time anomaly. He had found a rhythm, like tremors before a quake, a tempo before a fall. She called him that night. "Do you see it?" she asked. "Yes." "How big?" Calvin hesitated. "This one doesn't just hit the companies. It hits the trust." Sarah felt something cold crawl up her spine. "We need to tell someone. Go public." "No." "Why not?" "Because they'll discredit it. Or worse, bury it." She swallowed. "So what do we do?" There was a long silence on the other end. Then Calvin said, "We wait, and when the third one hits, we draw the line no one can ignore." But the world didn't wait. Within 72 hours, a third firm, Amberhold Asset Group, halted trading. No clear explanation. Markets trembled. Twitter caught fire. The phrase Brooks Curve began trending. and someone leaked a copy of Calvin's diagram, his full fault line pattern, to a financial blog. It showed 5 waves. 3 had already come true. The 4th, Calvin had labeled Consumer Credit Shock, Phase 4, 18 to 27 days. People panicked. They weren't laughing anymore. Soon after, Calvin was approached at a gas station by 2 men in suits. One flashed a vague government badge. The other remained silent. "You Mr. Brooks?" Calvin wiped his hands on his jeans. "Sometimes. We'd like to ask you some questions about your projections." Calvin tilted his head. "I don't make projections." The man smiled without humor. "Then maybe you'll show us your notebooks." "No." The man's smile faded. "We can make things difficult." Calvin looked him straight in the eye. "You already have. That's what the notebooks are for." The story was no longer quiet. New York Times ran a headline, "The Trucker Who Outsmarted the Street?" Forbes published, "Genius or Guesswork? Inside the Brooks Method." And a leaked internal memo from an investment bank read, "Do not engage or reference the Brooks pattern in public communications until instructed by legal," which only fueled the fire. Suddenly, Calvin Brooks became more than a man. He became a question, a symbol of something the financial world didn't want to admit, that maybe, just maybe, all their noise had blinded them to the music. And Calvin? He kept driving, from one coast to the other, listening to the way the world hummed. At a small truck stop in New Mexico, he pulled out a new notebook. Not red, not green, but black. On the first page, he drew a single symbol, a flat line, then a sudden, jagged spike. He labeled it Crash Window, Final Phase, 31 to 38 days. Then he wrote, carefully, beneath it, "If they still don't listen, let it burn." There was one page he never wanted anyone to see. Not because it was wrong, but because it was too right. It was late. The kind of late that pressed against your ribs like a weight. Calvin Brooks sat alone beside a campfire behind a truck depot near Flagstaff, Arizona, the cold desert wind tugging gently at his jacket. His rig was parked 30 yards away, dark and still like an animal at rest. Sparks drifted upward from the flames as he opened his black notebook. He hesitated. This page was different. It had no label, no color coding, no arrows or spirals, just one thick line across the middle. And then a sudden, violent fracture that split the page in two. He had drawn it once, and then he'd torn it out. Now, reluctantly, he had brought it back, and he was thinking of destroying it. Weeks earlier, Sarah had asked him about it, the missing page. They'd been sitting in the cab, sorting through his archive, when she noticed the break in sequence. "Notebook 5 jumps from page 42 to 44, she said, frowning. Calvin's eyes went distant. "I know." "Where's 43? He didn't answer. "Was it wrong?" "No," he said finally. "It was too right." Now, under the stars, he pulled the page from his coat pocket and stared at it like it was a ghost. He remembered the night he'd drawn it. It wasn't after a crash. It wasn't after data. It was after a dream. A dream where freight lines twisted like snakes, cities blinked out like dead lights, and screens across the nation all displayed the same message: liquidity not available. In the dream, he wasn't driving. He was walking, past empty trucks, empty shelves, angry voices, and silence. That was the worst part, not the fall, but the quiet after. The pattern he'd drawn the next morning hadn't looked like his usual work. It wasn't elegant. It was jagged, chaotic. No soft arcs, no mirrored feedback. Just collapse. He'd labeled it in the smallest handwriting of all, the point of no rebalance. And then he'd folded it and buried it. Because if that pattern came true, it wouldn't be just another company or sector or fund. It would be everything. The fire crackled. Calvin stared at the edge of the page, blackened from when he'd half-burned it weeks ago, then snatched it back. He remembered something his father once said, long before the man had died in that warehouse collapse. Truth ain't just what you can prove, son. Sometimes truth is what haunts you even when no one's looking. Calvin sighed. Then, without a word, he put the page back in his coat. Not yet. Meanwhile, Sarah Liang was in Washington. She had been invited, quietly, unofficially, to a closed-door briefing at a mid-level regulatory agency. The man across from her wore a tight smile and a flag pin. "We've reviewed the patterns," he said. "Very unconventional." "They're not predictions," Sarah said. "They're diagnostics." "Like a health scan." "Exactly. But the patient is the global system." He nodded slowly, then leaned forward. "Ms. Liang, if this Brooks curve is accurate, and we are entering a phase where consumer liquidity and logistical velocity are about to collapse in tandem, then we're not just looking at a market event. We're looking at societal trauma." He didn't flinch. "You're asking us to believe a truck driver with no formal training outmodeled 1,000 PhDs. Sarah didn't blink. He didn't outmodel them. He outlistened them. Silence. Then the official said, "And what does he think we should do?" Sarah almost laughed. "He thinks you won't." Back on the road, Calvin drove through Kansas. The fields were pale and endless. Wind turbines turned lazily above the wheat. He kept the black notebook in the passenger seat. Glanced at it occasionally like you might glance at a sleeping dog you don't fully trust. His CB radio crackled. A voice. "Hey, anyone hear about that bank in Milwaukee? 3 branches closed, overnight." Another. "My client in logistics says contract shipments just got slashed 40%. No reason given." Another. "Credit cards declining in waves. People think it's fraud. It ain't." Calvin turned the dial down. Not because he didn't want to hear, because he already had. Sarah called him that night. "Did you see the memo?" "What memo?" "The leak from Greyhawk Capital. They're pulling liquidity everywhere. No one's reporting it yet, but the drain started 3 days ago. One of your markers lit up. The double fracture." Calvin closed his eyes. "That's page 43. Sarah paused. "You still have it?" "I do." "Is it time?" Calvin looked at the rearview mirror, headlights behind him, miles of silence ahead. He whispered, "Not yet, but soon." Later, at a rest stop in Missouri, a teenage boy tapped on Calvin's truck window. "Are you the guy who draws the crash curves?" Calvin rolled it down. "What?" "You're viral. My econ teacher made us read about your stuff. She said you drew the fall of Lexicon and Greenmark before it happened." Calvin stared at him. "Why does that matter to you?" The boy shifted awkwardly. "Because my dad lost his pension in that collapse. I guess I just wanted to meet the guy who knew before anyone else, the one who saw it coming." Calvin nodded slowly, then handed him a page, not the dangerous one, but an older diagram, and said, "Tell your teacher, prediction is just pattern plus patience." That night, in the dark, Calvin opened his notebook one last time before sleep. He didn't add anything new. He just stared at the jagged fracture and thought, If this really is the last page, then what comes after it isn't a fall. It's a reckoning. He didn't want fame. He didn't want followers. All he ever wanted was to be wrong. The sun hadn't yet risen when Calvin Brooks stepped down from his truck in a forgotten corner of Nebraska. The air smelled of frost and oil. He wore the same worn jacket, the same quiet stare, but something in his posture had changed. The black notebook was clutched tighter now. He looked up at the sky, colorless still, and muttered under his breath, "Not yet." But the system didn't wait. In the days after the Amberhold collapse, the public began asking the question Calvin had feared all along. If someone saw it coming, why didn't they stop it? News anchors repeated his name with skepticism, admiration, and fear. The New Yorker ran a piece titled, "The Janitor of Finance," painting him as both a visionary and a symbol of institutional failure. CNBC, after mocking him weeks earlier, hosted a panel asking if Wall Street's smartest minds had missed what a trucker in Indiana had seen in his notebook behind a gas station. And still, Calvin said nothing. He kept driving. Sarah Liang was not so silent. Her voice had become a storm in quiet rooms. She met with economists, regulators, tech leaders. She showed them overlays of Calvin's symbols matched against data sets from the past 3 years. "You don't have to believe in his lines," she said. "Just look at where they lead." But belief was never the issue. Timing was. One official at a global bank leaned across the table and said, "If he's right, and this next fracture hits, people will panic. Markets are one thing, faith is another. We can't afford to lose that." Sarah snapped back. "You already did. You just haven't read the line yet." Back in Nebraska, Calvin met Jesse at a truck diner off Highway 83. Jesse looked tired. Too many interviews, too many questions he couldn't answer. "I don't know if I did you a favor or lit a match," he said, stirring his coffee. "You didn't do either," Calvin replied. Jesse glanced at the black notebook lying on the table between them like a loaded weapon. "So what now?" Calvin looked around. Waitresses refilling coffee, drivers nursing tired hands, people who didn't know they were about to be caught in the gears of something far bigger than themselves. "I wait," he said. "For what?" "For someone to ask the right question." Jesse frowned. "Which is?" Calvin's eyes flicked up. "Not, how did you know, but why did no one else?" Meanwhile, the data patterns continued to ripple. It began subtly. A sudden drop in regional diesel demand. Microloan defaults rising in rural zones. Package shipping delays, unreported, across 4 states. A credit union in Michigan freezing personal lines with no notice. Sarah saw it all and saw the pattern matching page 43. Exactly. She called Calvin again. "It's coming, isn't it?" "It's already here." Later that evening, Sarah stood in a packed auditorium at an independent data symposium in Chicago. Most of the audience didn't know her. Fewer had heard of Calvin. She didn't start with numbers. She started with a photo. A blurred image of Calvin's red notebook, open to a page from 6 months ago. Symbols. Curves. A jagged slope labeled Collapse Pulse Number 3, Synchronized Distortion. Then she showed the real-world data, side by side. The room fell silent. She ended her talk with one sentence. He didn't predict it. He simply listened when no one else was willing to hear the truth whispering beneath the noise. That same night, someone broke into Calvin's truck. He didn't hear them at first, but when he returned from the diner, the door was ajar. A drawer overturned, footprints on the mattress. The black notebook was still there. But someone had left something behind. a torn business card with no name, just a number. Calvin stared at it for a long time. Then, calmly, he tossed it into the sink and lit a match. He didn't need more silence. He needed one voice to speak up. The next morning, Sarah's phone rang. It was Calvin. "I'm ready," he said. "For what?" "For them to hear it from me." 3 days later, in a live-streamed panel hosted by an independent economic journal, Calvin appeared for the first time in front of cameras. No suit, no preamble, just a trucker jacket, tired eyes, and a worn notebook in his hands. He sat beside Sarah, in front of a digital projection of his drawings. The moderator asked, "Mr. Brooks, what gives you the confidence to claim we are on the verge of a financial collapse greater than 2008? Calvin didn't blink. "I don't claim it," he said. "I hear it. In the cracks, in the over-ordering, in the silence before a company stops replying to emails. I don't need your indexes. I have diesel receipts. I have empty warehouses. I have 1,100 nights listening to a system breathing wrong." The moderator frowned. "But what proof?" Sarah interrupted. The proof already happened. 3 firms fell. 2 more match the next markers. You're just waiting for the third to collapse so you can say it's real. He's not early. You're late. Calvin opened the black notebook. He turned to page 43, held it up, and said, "This is what silence looks like, right before it screams." They tried to silence him before he spoke, but truth has a rhythm louder than fear. The email arrived at 3:14 a.m. Subject line, "Urgent. Panel disruption. Security concerns." Sarah Liang read it twice, jaw tightening. The conference, the North American Forum on Decentralized Risk Modeling, had been planned for months. It was supposed to be fringe, quiet, off radar. But ever since Calvin Brooks had agreed to appear and walk the audience through page 43 of his black notebook, something shifted. Suddenly, tickets had sold out. Finance influencers had begun tweeting cryptic messages about the trucker's prophecy, and 2 sponsors pulled out without explanation. Now, hours before Calvin was set to speak, the venue's legal team wanted the panel postponed indefinitely. Sarah picked up her phone and called Calvin. He answered on the second ring. "I saw it coming." "Of course you did," she muttered. "Do we cancel?" "No," he said. "Let them try." That morning, Calvin arrived at the Chicago venue with his usual slow gait. He wore his green trucker jacket, jeans, and boots scuffed from 1,000 miles of America's overlooked roads. In his hand, a single folder containing 3 diagrams. One of them, drawn just last night, was darker than the others. He called it the reverberation arc. It wasn't a collapse. It was what came after the collapse, a pattern of erratic overcorrection, bank pulls, liquidity hoarding, consumer panic, a financial echo chamber. Calvin knew this would be the most dangerous page he'd ever shown. Security at the venue was tight, too tight. An organizer leaned in and whispered to Sarah, "We've received pressure. Certain institutions do not want this event broadcast." She stared at him. "Which institutions?" He hesitated. "Let's just say, people who've spent a lot of money not seeing what Mr. Brooks is about to show." Sarah turned to Calvin. "We can still walk away." He shook his head. "They already printed the program." As they walked to the green room, someone passed Calvin in the hallway and murmured under their breath, "You're not supposed to teach people to hear the cracks." He turned. The man was gone. The stage was dim. Just 2 chairs and a wide screen. The room was packed. Not just economists and data scientists, but journalists, hedge fund interns, community bankers, even retirees holding notepads. Whispers moved through the crowd like a current. He's here. That's the trucker guy. He's the one who saw the lexicon crash, right? Calvin stepped onto the stage and stood behind the podium. He didn't begin with a quote or credentials. He held up a plain sheet of paper, unfolded it, and said softly, "This is not a prediction. This is a consequence." On the screen appeared his full model, the reverberation arc. The room stilled. It showed 5 waves. Each wave wasn't a collapse, but a reaction to one. Overcorrection, asset freeze, short squeeze bubbles, structural withdrawal. At the bottom he had written, "The system will not break all at once. It will stagger until it collapses quietly." One economist in the front row stood up mid-presentation and walked out, shaking his head. A hedge fund analyst nearby whispered, "It's too clean, too simplified." Sarah stepped in. "No, it's too honest. That's what you can't handle." Calvin took the mic again. "I didn't invent this," he said. "I witnessed it. On the road, in grocery stores, in fuel receipts, in how fast ads change on your phones. You call it anecdotal. I call it empirical, but more than anything—" He paused, eyes scanning the room. "I call it ignored." Then he clicked to the next slide. It was a chart of shipping frequency from 6 states over the past 90 days, overlaid with one of his earliest symbols, the pulled string curve. Every point matched. 3 audience members gasped aloud. Someone whispered, "That's impossible." But it wasn't, because it was already happening. Backstage, a coordinator received a text and ran to Sarah. "They want to cut the feed." "Who?" "Head of PR from one of the sponsor firms. They say it's becoming destabilizing content." Sarah clenched her fists. "No. This is the only content that matters right now." Calvin finished with a single statement. "If your systems are so fragile that one truck driver's drawings can shake them, maybe the systems weren't that stable to begin with." The crowd rose. Not applause. Silence. Reverent, rattled silence. As if they were all hearing the echo he had heard for years. But the silence didn't last. Within an hour of the talk, the live stream was pulled from 3 platforms. The venue issued a statement calling the panel an unendorsed fringe opinion. Later that night, Sarah found Calvin sitting in the hotel parking lot, smoking a rare cigarette. "You were right," she said. "They're trying to bury it." He exhaled. "It was never about them hearing me. It was about someone else finally seeing it." She sat beside him. "You think anyone in that room will change something?" "I think a few already did." He looked up at the stars. "You know how a tree cracks before it falls?" "Yeah." "They heard the crack tonight." The markets didn't crash that day. The screens did. And the man who had no screens knew exactly what it meant. It happened on a Thursday. At exactly 10:04 a.m. Eastern Time, major trading platforms across the U.S. froze. Not crashed, froze. The charts stopped moving. Balances vanished. Buy and sell orders hung like ghosts in the wires. Then came the blackout. Screens went black in Boston first, then New York, then Chicago. Within 6 minutes, the entire northeast corridor of high-frequency trades went dark. Panic didn't arrive with a bang. It arrived with a blank screen. Sarah Liang was in a glass office on the 27th floor of a fintech firm in Boston when it happened. She blinked at her terminal, refreshed it, refreshed again. Nothing. Her phone vibrated. 27 unread messages in 2 minutes. She looked up. Everyone in the room was staring at their screens. No one was speaking. It was as if they all heard something that wasn't there. A missing hum. The silence after a system dies. Calvin Brooks was from 200 miles away, parked on the shoulder of a rural highway in Arkansas. He didn't need screens. He'd seen it coming in the way freight orders had shifted, in the delay between purchase and pickup, in the way small-town banks began quietly replacing their storefront signage, less emphasis on lending, more on community support. He sat behind the wheel of his rig, watching trucks crawl slower across the lanes like ants before a storm. He opened his black notebook, flipped past the reverberation arc, stopped at a symbol labeled only Static Bloom. It looked like an explosion caught mid-breath. He'd drawn it over a year ago, and he had written in the corner, almost like a footnote, "Screens go silent, but the damage keeps moving." Back in Boston, Sarah ran down to the street. Phones weren't connecting. Internet was stuttering. A strange, nauseating calm hung in the air, like the moment before glass shatters. People were gathered outside the bank headquarters across the street. Not yelling, just waiting. "What do they think is going to happen?" someone asked. Sarah didn't respond. She knew. Nothing would happen all at once. That's what made it worse. By noon, analysts began speculating it was a cyber attack. By 1 p.m., the government had issued a brief statement about technical anomalies under review. By 3 p.m., 2 firms had internally acknowledged that they had no visibility into the liquidity of their own holdings. And by 6 p.m., news broke that 3 separate regional banks had quietly closed their digital access. The markets didn't crash. They just paused. And in the pause, trust drained out like a punctured lung. Sarah called Calvin. He answered after 1 ring. "You saw this coming, didn't you?" she asked. "I saw the shape of it," he said. "Didn't know the color." "What do we do?" "Nothing." She went silent. "I mean it," Calvin said. "You don't run into a burning building with a garden hose. You wait. Watch which way it leans." Sarah nearly dropped the phone. "You think it's going to fall?" "I think," he said quietly, "the floor's already gone. We're just still pretending to stand." That night, Calvin pulled off the road near an abandoned truck stop in Oklahoma. The air was thick with summer heat and something else. Something no one could name. He pulled out a fresh page. For the first time in months, he hesitated. Then he drew a new symbol. It wasn't like the others. It was a spiral, but broken at the top. Unfinished. He stared at it for a long time before writing a single word. Decision. He didn't know what it meant yet, only that it hadn't happened. And when it did, it wouldn't be data. It would be human. Back in Boston, Sarah met with 2 journalists in secret. She showed them Calvin's diagrams, walked them through the page labeled Phase 4, Liquidity Mirage. They sat in silence for a full minute. Then one of them whispered, "Why is this not the front page of every paper in the country?" Sarah answered, "Because the people in charge can't afford to admit they missed something this obvious, especially from someone they never invited to the table." The blackout lasted 7 hours. When the systems came back online, balances were lower. Positions had shifted. Some transactions were untraceable. Others were reversed, and something had changed in people's eyes. Not panic, not yet, just doubt. And doubt, Calvin knew, was the crack before collapse. The next morning, an anonymous message appeared on several financial forums. There's no attack. There's no bug. It's just too big to carry its own weight anymore. Ask the trucker. He already drew the last page. It was signed, "Someone who listened too late." The system hadn't fallen. Not yet. But everyone could feel it holding its breath. It had been 6 days since the blackout. The headlines had shifted from glitch to incident to anomalous market freeze. Every official explanation danced around the truth. None used the word collapse. But in diners and truck stops, on radio shows and message boards, people had started calling it something else. The Brooks Pause. In a small gas station near Amarillo, Texas, Calvin Brooks sat alone in his rig, looking out at a landscape that felt oddly still. The world hadn't ended, but it was waiting. You could feel it in how cashiers asked fewer questions, in the way people pumped gas with their heads down, in the silence of managers on morning calls. Systems hadn't crashed, but faith had. Calvin opened his notebook and flipped to a page he hadn't touched since the beginning. A page he had once labeled only the fifth signal. It was unlike the others. Not a curve, not a wave, not a drop. It was a gap. A break in rhythm. A moment between moments. He had never drawn it fully, only left an open space, a blank divide where everything before ended and nothing after had yet begun. Now, he drew 2 thin lines, one sloping upward, the other spiraling down. He labeled them recovery, restructure, and then, under both, in trembling ink, or rupture. Back in New York, Sarah Liang watched the spread between major financial institutions begin to widen unnaturally. Liquidity was technically available, but no one was lending. Not really. It was trust, not money, that had vanished. And you couldn't print trust. She called Calvin that evening. "Something's coming," she said. He was silent on the line. She continued, "But it's not a crash. It's like the ground is soft, and no one wants to be the first to step forward." Calvin replied, "Because they know the ground won't hold." She exhaled. "So what happens now?" He answered without hesitation. "People start walking backward, quietly, until only the loud ones are left pretending everything is fine." That night, Calvin stopped at a rest area with only 2 trucks parked. The night was still, the air warm and heavy. He sat on a picnic bench, staring at the sky. He didn't feel like a prophet. He felt like a man who'd spent too long listening to whispers no one else could hear. He pulled out a page from the back of the notebook, one he had never dared to use. And he began to draw what came after the 5th signal. Not collapse, not silence, but choice. He drew 2 parallel symbols. One was a downward spiral morphing into dust. The other was a jagged break, followed by branches, forks, new shapes. They weren't warnings. They were paths. He titled the page, "Realignment," and beneath it, "After the 5th fracture, the system doesn't recover. It doesn't reboot. It reforms. Or it doesn't survive." Elsewhere, in a darkened boardroom in San Francisco, 5 executives reviewed a private report stamped classified. Its title? The Brooks Curve, Viability and Response Strategy. The first page included a timeline Calvin had sketched nearly a year ago, 5 phases of destabilization. All 4 prior phases had been marked complete. Only the 5th, labeled Pending Decision Event, remained open. One executive muttered, We have to get ahead of this, before people realize how close we are to free fall. Another whispered, He already got ahead of it. We're following his footsteps. Sarah released a quiet update on her independent analytics blog. It was short, no equations, no graphs, just 2 lines. Markets don't fall in a day, they fall in denial. It was shared 10,000 times in under an hour. Back in his truck, Calvin looked at the final diagram and folded it once, twice, then tucked it under the visor, above the windshield. Not for himself, for whoever came next. Because there would always be someone standing too close to the silence, trying to name the sound it was about to make. And they'd need to know the cracks weren't prophecy, they were memory, patterns, sung by a system that had always known how to break, and sometimes how to begin again. When the last collapse came, they looked for the man who warned them, but he was already gone, leaving behind not a name, but a language. It wasn't an explosion. It was a long breath finally exhaled. In early November, the 5th signal came, not as a crash, but as a freeze. One by one, regional banks announced temporary halts on fund withdrawals. Then came the asset management firms. Then the mortgage servicers. A dull chain of paused trust. Markets shivered. Not because they didn't expect it, but because deep down, they did. At 8:03 a.m. on the morning of the final rupture, Sarah Liang stepped into a silent boardroom in Manhattan. Phones were ringing, but no one was answering. Screens flashed error codes. A man with graying hair stood by the window, muttering, "It's not supposed to be this fragile." Sarah knew better. She opened her laptop, pulled up Calvin's last diagram, the one labeled realignment, the one no algorithm could model, no executive dared to print. It showed not a fall, but a split, a choice. Meanwhile, in a quiet diner outside Santa Fe, the waitress realized something strange. The man who always sat in the corner booth every Tuesday morning, the one with the notebooks and black coffee, wasn't there. She checked the time. He was never late. She asked around the station. No one had seen the green truck. Not since Friday. 3 states away, a young programmer from Portland sat at his desk staring at a crude PDF, a scan of one of Calvin's older diagrams someone had posted anonymously. The caption read, "He warned us. He showed us." This was never about being right. It was about seeing what came after. Across the country, the symbols began to appear, on forums, in Discord groups, on whiteboards in university classrooms. Notations once mocked as madness were now being reverse-engineered by economists and mathematicians, not to predict collapse, but to understand structure. People didn't quote Calvin, they translated him. Sarah didn't hear from him again, not directly, but one morning she opened her mail and found a single page. It was folded neatly, no return address. The paper was soft from wear. On it, a final drawing. No spirals, no fractures, just a single horizontal line drawn in blue, flat, peaceful, with a small curve at the right edge bending upward like a sunrise. Below it, written in a hand she knew by heart, the first shape of something new. She wept, not from grief, but from recognition. Years passed. The world did not end. But it did change. The financial system fractured and reformed, not because of policy, but because enough people listened. Not to fear, but to rhythm, to silence, to each other. And sometimes, in moments of quiet, when a new pattern flickered into view, someone would reach for a piece of scrap paper and sketch and say, "He would have drawn it like this." And in that act, a circle incomplete, a curve without a label, the ghost of a man with oil-stained hands and a gift for listening lived on, not as a prophet, not as a myth, but as a map no one could sign, because it belonged to everyone. Calvin Brooks never held a title, never earned a doctorate, never rang a closing bell or wore a tailored suit. But in the quiet spaces between numbers, he saw what others refused to see. And he left behind more than warnings. He left a language, one drawn in patience, in silence, in the margins no one was looking at. And maybe, in that language, we will learn not just how to avoid collapse, but how to build something that listens back.